Ever get that feeling like you're just drowning in these philosophical texts, wishing someone would like boil it all down, give you the good stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of those historical texts are dense.
Well, that's what we're doing today. Taking all those complex ideas and making them, well, make sense.
Yeah, we're doing a deep dive into Dharmakīrti.
Dharmakīrti, a huge name in Indian Buddhist philosophy, but I feel like even in philosophy, he's not as widely known.
Right. Not a household name exactly.
Yeah.
But he should be. I mean, think about it. He basically, along with the Gegha, really changed how Buddhists argued and reasoned.
Yeah. Together, they pretty much created what's known as the epistemological school.
Or, as some traditions like to call it, those who follow reasoning. Really gets to the heart of what they were about.
And that's what makes him so fascinating for us, right? As philosophers. It wasn't just about religious dogma. It was about taking on the whole philosophical landscape of his time.
Exactly. They were grappling with these massive questions. Like, what is reality? How do we know anything? What is language and how does it even work? And they did it with a level of sophistication that's really impressive.
Yeah, and that influence, it's huge, especially within the Mahayana Buddhist traditions.
For sure.
So what we're aiming for today, it's to take these super complex ideas of Dharmakīrti and really make them understandable.
Exactly. We want to make this stuff accessible to anyone who, enjoys philosophy.
Right, without getting too bogged down in all the jargon that can sometimes come with this territory.
Exactly. And to guide us through this, we've got an excellent resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Dharmakīrti. Really thorough, very reliable.
It's going to be our map for this whole exploration.
Exactly. And I think it'll provide a really solid foundation for understanding him. So what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to be looking at the core of Dharmakīrti's thought, his metaphysics.
Yeah. His views on what truly exists, versus what's just kind of a mental fabrication.
Right. We'll look at his epistemology, how we know things, the sources of knowledge. How do we know if something's reliable? And of course, we got to dive into his philosophy of language.
How do words actually connect to reality? I mean, that's a huge question.
Huge. And to round it all off, we'll look at his contributions to logic, the framework for how to think well.
So let's dive in. And we'll start with probably his most radical idea, that universals are not real.
Yes, absolutely. This is where he firmly plants himself in the nominalist camp.
Nominalism. For people who might not be familiar, can you break that down a bit?
Sure. So nominalism basically says that only particular things are real. This specific chair, that specific tree, individual things. Universals, on the other hand, they're these general categories, like redness or humanity, that supposedly apply to many things. Well, Dharmakīrti, he thought those were unreal.
Just fictions.
Yeah, basically. Mental constructs, useful for language and thought, but they don't actually exist independently. It's a pretty bold stance when you think about the history of philosophy, right?
Bold. But he doesn't just say it, right? He had some arguments to back this up. What about the classic one-many problem? How did Dharmakīrti use that?
So the one-many problem, it points out this inherent tension in the concept of universals. How can one thing, like redness, be present in many different individual red objects at the same time? It's like if you have a single cookie and you try to share it with 10 people.
You're going to end up with crumbs.
Exactly. And for Dharmakīrti, that was a major problem for the idea of universals. It just doesn't make sense.
Makes sense. And then there's the concept of samavaya, right, which is inherence. How did Dharmakīrti deal with that?
Yeah, this is a key concept in some schools of Indian philosophy, like the Nyaya. They said that universals inhere in particulars. It's like a special relationship that connects them. But for Dharmakīrti, it just added unnecessary complexity.
A bit like inventing a whole new type of glue to explain how the cookie sticks to all its crumbs.
Yeah, kind of. It's like if you're already skeptical of the cookie existing in the first place, then why invent a special glue for it?
Good point. So Dharmakīrti is all about getting rid of anything that doesn't actually do anything, which leads us to his big criterion for reality, causal efficacy. If something is real, it has to have the power to make things happen.
Exactly. This is his touchstone. If something can't cause anything, it's not real.
And he calls this arthakriya samartha, right? Causal powers.
Yep. And for him, only those specific individual things, those particulars, have causal powers. They're the actors on the stage of reality, universals. They're just like these static backdrops.
Not really doing anything.
Right, exactly. No agency. And this idea of causal efficacy, it really underpins his doctrine of momentariness, right?
Kankatva, the idea that everything exists for just a tiny little instant.
Yes, it's radical. Nothing lasts. Everything's in constant flux.
Yeah.
Arising and ceasing. And that doesn't just apply to, abstract qualities. It applies to what we think of as stable objects, too.
Right. So a table, a person even, it's not one continuous thing. It's actually a super fast succession of momentary events.
Like a film reel, really. A series of frames that creates the illusion of continuous motion.
But each frame is different.
Precisely. And there's no unchanging substance or essence that persists through those frames.
It's a pretty mind-blowing concept when you really think about it. Like, what does it even mean for us to have a personal identity over time if there's no stable self that endures?
Yeah, it really challenges our basic intuitions about identity. Now, Dharmakīrti, being the rigorous thinker that he was, actually offers arguments for this view of momentariness. One is the vinascitvandamana, the inference from perishing.
This one has always seemed a bit tricky to me.
It is a bit obscure, I'll grant you that. The argument basically says that perishing, or ceasing to exist, is inherent to all things. It happens spontaneously, without any external cause, as soon as something comes into being. So as soon as something arises, it's already on its way out.
It's like it's programmed to self-destruct.
Yeah. And the reason for this, according to Dharmakīrti, is that non-existence itself can't act as a cause. So something can't be destroyed by an external force of nothingness. Therefore, ceasing to exist must be an intrinsic property of existence itself.
But doesn't that raise some really difficult questions about the nature of causality and even about what it means to exist in the first place?
It does. It's a really dense argument, and it has definitely sparked a lot of debate among Buddhist philosophers.
Yeah. But the other argument for momentariness, the sattvandamana, the inference from the mere fact of existing, that one seems more straightforward, maybe?
Yes, this one's definitely more central. And it basically goes like this. Anything that exists and has properties must be able to cause effects. And a permanent, unchanging thing, it just wouldn't be able to do that.
Because it would always be the same.
Right. How could something unchanging produce different effects at different times? It just wouldn't make sense.
So change, the ability to cause different effects, is like built into the very fabric of existence.
That's the idea. And Dharmakīrti really elaborated on this point in his work, the Vedanya. He said that a permanent cause couldn't produce effects either simultaneously, because it's just one thing, or successively, because there would be no reason for the effect to change if the cause stayed the same.
Makes you think. But someone could argue, couldn't they, that a permanent cause could produce different effects if the circumstances change?
Yeah, that's a very common objection.
Like a light bulb. It's always capable of producing light, but it only does so when you flip the switch.
That's a great example. So how does Dharmakīrti counter that? Well, he says that if a supposedly permanent cause stayed exactly the same while its effects change depending on the circumstances, then it's really those changing circumstances that are doing the causing, not the permanent thing.
Right. So in the light bulb example, it's the flipping of the switch that's really causing the light, not the bulb itself.
Exactly. The bulb is just there. Whether it's on or off, it's a necessary condition, but not the actual cause of the light coming on.
And this gets to the heart of Dharmakīrti's focus on co-presence and co-absence as the test for true causality.
Absolutely. He uses the Sanskrit terms anvaya for co-presence and vyatireka for co-absence. It's a powerful analytical tool. If something is a genuine cause, it should be present when the effect is present and absent when the effect is absent.
Okay, so these fleeting particulars, they have causal powers, and these powers are basically what we understand as their properties, right?
Right. Properties aren't something separate that particulars have. It's more like they're their causal powers.
So a particular thing isn't like a container that holds properties. It's more like a bundle of causal powers that are constantly changing.
Exactly. And each of these powers, these properties, are also particulars specific to that moment and that place.
It's like a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of unique causal potentialities.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And this is what distinguishes Dharmakīrti's view from, say, the substance attribute model found in other philosophical traditions.
Where you have a substance, like a ball, and then attributes, like its color or size. But here, everything's dynamic.
Everything's in flux. And this really gets to his idea of svabhava pratibandha, which is the connection by essential natures between cause and effect.
So cause and effect aren't just randomly connected. There's like a deep intrinsic link between them.
Exactly. They're bound together, inseparable, like smoke and fire. You can't have smoke without fire. The very nature of smoke is to have originated from fire. This leads him to the concept of avinavavanyama.
Avinavavanyama, which means?
It's the principle that the effect will not be without the cause. It's like a law of nature, in this case, the law of smoke and fire. If something is truly smoke, it must have fire as its origin. It can't be otherwise.
So when he says must here, is he talking about like a strict metaphysical necessity, something that holds true in all possible worlds?
That's a very interesting question. And it gets to the heart of how we interpret Dharmakīrti. While the connection he's describing is strong, he wasn't really working within a framework of possible worlds the way modern philosophers do. So the must here is more about epistemic certainty.
It's about how we know things for sure in this world.
Right. It's about recognizing this fundamental connection between cause and effect based on our experience and reasoning. And it's about the fact that within the causal structure of reality, as we understand it, the effect simply cannot deviate from the cause.
Okay, so in contrast to someone like Hume, who saw causality as more about just observing regular patterns, Dharmakīrti is arguing for something deeper.
Yeah, exactly. So while Dharmakīrti definitely valued observation, he was a big proponent of what we call Anvaya and Vaitarika, co-presence and co-absence. He believed those regularities were grounded in the inherent causal powers of things. They weren't just random coincidences.
So it's not just that we see fire always producing smoke. It's that fire has to produce smoke because of what fire is at its core.
That's it. That's the essence of his view.
Okay, I think we've done a pretty good job unpacking Dharmakīrti's metaphysics. Now let's shift gears and talk about how we actually know all this stuff. You know, his epistemology and his philosophy of language.
Perfect. Let's do it. So Dharmakīrti, building on the work of Dignega, accepted two main sources of knowledge, two pramachas.
And those are?
Pratya, which is direct perception, and anumaka, which is inference.
Okay, so perception is like when you directly experience something with your senses, and inference is like when you use reasoning to figure something out.
Right. But Dharmakīrti makes a really crucial distinction. For him, perception in its purest form is non-conceptual.
Meaning
it grasps those unique particulars without relying on any concepts or categories. It's like pure, raw sensory data. Inference, on the other hand, operates with concepts, with those general categories like blue or tree. And those, as we've discussed, are not really real for Dharmakīrti. They're just mental constructs.
So we've got this interesting situation where perception gives us access to the real stuff, the particulars, but our thinking and language are all about these unreal concepts. How can we ever really know anything about the world if there's this disconnect?
That's the central puzzle of Dharmakīrti's epistemology. How do we bridge this gap?
Yeah.
And his answer lies in the way he defines what a valid source of knowledge, a pramat, actually is.
So how does he define it?
For him, a pramat is reliable cognition.
Reliable cognition. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's knowledge that doesn't mislead us. In Sanskrit, it's avisadin for reliable and jnana for cognition. So it's not just any random thought or belief. It has to be a way of knowing that leads to successful action in the world.
So if my perception of a water bottle leads me to successfully drink water and quench my thirst, that confirms that my perception was reliable.
Exactly. That's what he calls arthakrasiti, confirming causal efficacy. It's about seeing whether our cognitions actually lead to the expected results.
And this confirmation, does it always have to come from external actions? Or can some cognitions be inherently reliable?
That's a key distinction he makes. Some things are considered svata pramakya, intrinsically reliable, like direct sensory perceptions. We generally trust our senses unless we have a specific reason to doubt them. Same with valid logical inferences.
So we don't need to test every single perception or inference against its practical results?
Not necessarily. They have a kind of built-in reliability. But other cognitions might need further confirmation.
Like if I see something in the distance that looks like a person, I might need to get closer to be sure it's not a scarecrow.
Yeah, exactly. And this emphasis on reliable cognition and the need for confirmation, does it make Dharmakīrti an internalist about justification? Does he think we need to be consciously aware of the reasons why our beliefs are justified?
That's a good question. What do you think?
Well, it's a tricky one. Dharmakīrti definitely emphasized the importance of what he calls nishkaya, ascertainment, which is like having this firm conviction in the truth of a cognition and its basis. But it's not clear if he meant that we always need explicit conscious access to all the reasons.
It could be more about whether the cognition was in fact produced through reliable processes, even if we're not always explicitly aware of every step.
Yeah, that's a plausible interpretation.
And what about the idea of svasasavana, reflexive awareness? This is another big idea in Buddhist epistemology, right? Consciousness is not only aware of its objects, but also of itself. Does this imply that we need to be aware of our cognitive states for them to be considered knowledge?
It's a really interesting concept, but I don't think it settles the internalism-externalism debate. Even if we have this internal awareness of our thoughts and inferences, that doesn't automatically guarantee they're true or reliable.
Being aware of having a thought doesn't mean that thought accurately represents the world.
Exactly. Reflexive awareness is important, but it's not the whole story when it comes to justification.
So we're back to this challenge. We've got perception giving us access to particulars, but our thought and language are stuck in the realm of concepts, which Dharmakīrti says are unreal. How do we bridge this gap?
This is where his apoha theory comes in, right?
Right, the apoha theory. It's super important for understanding how Dharmakīrti thinks about language. Apoha means exclusion or differentiation, and it's his attempt to explain how we can talk about real particulars even though language is built on these general concepts.
It's like we're trying to grasp something slippery with tools that are too big and clumsy.
Yeah, it's tricky. And the reason it's tricky is because for Dharmakīrti, particulars are ultimately ineffable. Meaning they can't be fully expressed in language. In Sanskrit, that's avyapadesha. Each particular is so unique, so specific, that words just can't capture it.
Words are too general.
Exactly, too blunt. So the apoha theory is about finding a way for language to work, even though it can't directly refer to these ineffable particulars. And the original version of apoha, the one developed by Dignaga, was about exclusion, right? Anupoha. Can you explain that?
Yes. Dignaga said that concepts don't really grasp some positive essence shared by things. Instead, they work by excluding everything that the thing is not. So the concept blue doesn't refer to some universal blueness. Instead, it's a mental boundary that carves out everything that's non-blue.
So blue is basically not non-blue, a double negative.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how Dignaga tried to account for how we can have general concepts without needing universals.
But I imagine there were some problems with this view, right?
Oh yeah, there were definitely criticisms. One of the biggest was the charge of circularity. If you define blue as not non-blue, then to understand blue, you need to first understand non-blue. But to understand non-blue, you need to understand blue, because non-blue includes everything that's not blue.
It's like a dog chasing its own tail.
Yeah. And there were also problems with how this view could handle the compositionality of language. How we combine simple concepts to create more complex meanings. If everything's just defined by what it's not, it gets very hard to build up complex meanings.
Makes sense. So Dharmakīrti came along and decided to revise the apoha theory, right?
He did. And he shifted the focus to causality. So instead of just being about negation and exclusion, his version of apoha emphasizes the causal connection between words and things.
No, it's like a causal chain.
Exactly. It starts with the particulars, those real things out there in the world. When we perceive them, they cause certain effects in our senses.
Like when light from a blue flower hits our eyes, it triggers specific signals in our visual system.
Right, and those signals then cause certain mental images or representations to arise in our minds.
And then those mental images, along with our prior knowledge and conceptual frameworks, lead to judgments like, this is blue.
And at that point, the apoha, the general concept that differentiates blue from non-blue, pops up in our minds. So the reason our thoughts and words refer to blue things and not, say, red things is because of this specific causal history.
It's like a fingerprint. Each concept is linked back to the particular things that caused it to arise in the first place.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So how does this initial connection between a word and a particular thing get established?
Yeah, how do we go from experiencing a specific blue flower to having the general concept blue? And how does that concept then get shared and used by a whole community?
So Dharmakīrti seems to suggest a two-step process. First, there's this initial act of reference fixing. He says it happens at the time of establishing the linguistic convention. In Sanskrit, that's sakalakakal. Imagine someone pointing at a patch of blue and saying, this is blue.
So someone's intentionally, linking the word to a specific instance.
Yes. Intention is key. Dharmakīrti calls it vivaka. It's like a baptism. You're giving a name to this specific perceptual experience. And then other people in the community learn and use this convention.
They borrow the reference.
Exactly. They use the word blue because they've had similar experiences of blue things, and they see how others are using the word. This happens at the time of using language conventions, vyavaharakale.
So it's like a combination of individual experience and social learning.
Exactly. But this raises a question. What about enyapoha, the exclusion of others? Does that still play a role in Dharmakīrti's theory, even though it's now grounded in causality?
Good question. I mean, we can't just forget about it.
Get the debate. Some scholars think Enyapoha becomes less important in Dharmakirti's version, but others think it still has a crucial role, maybe more on a metaphysical level than a purely semantic one.
Can you unpack that a bit?
Okay, so the causal chain explains how words get connected to particulars, but we still need to explain how those words can then apply to other particulars that weren't part of that initial naming event.
Like how after seeing one blue flower and learning the word blue, I can then correctly call a blue car blue, even though I've never seen that car before.
Exactly. And Enopoha might be the key, because it says that the meaning of blue isn't about some positive essence shared by all blue things. It's about what it's not.
So even though all those different blue things might have slightly different causal powers, they're all grouped together because they're not any of the things that would cause us to say red or green or whatever.
Exactly. So Enyapoha might be how Dharmakirti explains how we can have general concepts that apply to multiple particulars without needing real universals.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's still this nagging worry, right? If different blue things cause the same judgment, this is blue, doesn't that suggest they must share some kind of common property?
Yeah, that's a sharp observation. How can they have the same power without a universal?
It's like they're all playing the same note, even though they're different instruments.
Right. But Dharmakirti had an answer for that too. He said that no, those different blue particulars don't actually have a numerically identical power. They might all lead to the judgment, this is blue. But the specific ways they do that, the exact causal mechanisms, can be different.
So it's not like they all have the same key that unlocks the blue judgment in our minds. It's more like they each have their own unique way of picking the lock.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Right.
So the grouping together happens negatively. They're all blue because they're not any of the things that would trigger a different color judgment.
And that negative grouping, that's the epaha. Not a real universal, just a way of carving up the world based on what things are not.
Exactly. So we're always coming back to this central point. No universals allowed. Fair. Only particulars. Okay, I think we've spent enough time in the land of Apaha.
Yeah. Let's move on to something a bit more, well, maybe not easier, but something different. Logic. How did Dharmakirti think about good reasoning? What were his criteria for a solid argument?
Awesome. Let's dive into that. So the standard Buddhist model of reasoning, the one Dharmakirti inherited and refined, typically goes like this. A is B because of being C, like D.
Okay, so A is the thing we're talking about, the subject. B is what we're trying to prove about it, the probandum. C is the reason we're giving, the probans. And D is an example to illustrate the point.
Perfect. You got it. So, for example, we might say sound is impermanent because it's produced, like a pot.
So here, sound is A, impermanent is B, produced is C, and pot is D.
Exactly. And the key here is C, the reason. It has to be a good reason. And there's a whole system for determining what counts as a good reason in Buddhist logic.
And alongside these standard arguments, there's also the method of prasaga, right? A way of showing that an opponent's view leads to absurd conclusions.
Yes. Prasaga is like a reductio ad absurdum. It's a powerful tool for debate. You basically show that if you accept your opponent's claim, it logically leads to something crazy or contradictory. So their claim must be wrong.
It's like saying, if you really believe that cats can fly, then you must also believe that fish can sing.
Yeah. You're reducing their argument to absurdity. Now, going back to those good reasons we were talking about, what does it actually mean for a reason to be good in Dharmakirti's system?
It's not just about the form of the argument, right? It's got to be grounded in reality, too.
Absolutely. It can't just be logically valid in the abstract. It has to actually hold true in the world. And Dharmakirti developed this really sophisticated set of criteria for evaluating reasons called the Trirupya, the triple condition.
Triple condition. That sounds rigorous. What are those three conditions?
All right, get ready for some Sanskrit terms. So the first one is pakadharmatva, which basically means that the reasons C has to be actually present in the subject A.
So in our sound example, we'd have to be sure that sound really is produced.
Exactly. We can't just assume that. It has to be established. The second condition is in vihyavyapti, co-presence. It means that whenever the reason C is present, the thing we're trying to prove, B, is also present.
Like whenever something is produced, it's also impermanent.
Right. And we often use examples to show this. Like we know that pots are produced and they're also impermanent. So that supports the general connection between being produced and being impermanent.
Makes sense. And the third condition?
The third one is vyatarekavyapti, co-absence. It means that whenever B is absent, C is also absent.
So if something is permanent, it can't have been produced.
Exactly. And again, we use examples to illustrate this. We might point to things that are generally considered permanent, like the sky, and show that they're also not produced.
So it's not just about the logical structure of the argument. It's also about making sure that the premises are true and that the reason is genuinely connected to the conclusion in the real world.
Right. And there's this constant emphasis on making sure things are ascertained, reliably known to be true. Dharmakīrti uses the term nishita a lot.
So there's a strong epistemic component to all of this. It's not just about playing logic games.
Not at all. It's about making sure our arguments are actually grounded in knowledge. And there are also these implicit pragmatic considerations, right? Like, who are you arguing with? What are you trying to convince them of?
It's like knowing your audience.
Exactly. And understanding the context of the debate. And that brings us to the concept of inference for others, parathanumana.
Which is how you present a logical argument in a debate setting.
Yeah. And Dharmakīrti and his followers, they were very specific about how you do this. You present your argument in two parts. First, you state the provision, like wherever there's smoke, there's fire.
Like a general rule.
Right. And then you apply that rule to the specific case you're arguing about. So you might say, and this hill has smoke.
So the listener can put two and two together and conclude that the hill must have fire.
Yeah. But here's the interesting thing. You don't actually state the conclusion explicitly. That's considered a point of defeat, a nigrahasthana.
It's like you're giving your opponent enough rope to hang themselves.
Yeah, it's about leading them to the conclusion, not just shoving it down their throats.
Which is so different from the way we usually think about arguments, right? With the conclusion being the main point.
Totally. And it shows how Dharmakīrti's system was really geared towards debate and persuasion.
It's about getting the other person to see the truth for themselves.
Exactly. Now, this whole system of logic operates with concepts that are ultimately based on the apoha theory, right? Those exclusions rather than positive universals. Does this create any problems?
Good question. Like, do those weird exclusion-based concepts mess up the logic somehow?
Well, it does raise some interesting issues, especially when we think about the principle of substitutivity of identicals.
Substitutivity. That sounds complicated.
Yeah, it's a bit technical. But the basic idea is that if two things are truly identical, you should be able to substitute one for the other in any context without changing the truth of the statement.
So if Clark Kent and Superman refer to the same guy, then saying Clark Kent can fly should be just as true as saying Superman can fly.
Exactly. But things get tricky when we're dealing with concepts that are coextensive, meaning they apply to the same set of things, but might have different meanings.
So in Dharmakīrti's system, two concepts might pick out the same particulars in the world because they exclude the same things, but they might still be conceptually distinct.
Yes, like being impermanent and being produced. For Dharmakīrti, those are coextensive. Everything that's produced is impermanent and vice versa.
But they don't mean exactly the same thing, do they?
Right. And this can cause problems for substitution. Dharmakīrti himself gives this example about sound. Sound is impermanent because it's produced, like a plot.
So here, being produced is the reason for the impermanence of sound. But if we substitute the coextensive concept being impermanent, we get sound is impermanent because it's impermanent.
Which is totally circular. It's not a real argument anymore.
So even though the two concepts pick out the same set of things, they can't be freely swapped in a logical argument.
And Dharmakīrti realized this. He said that the problem arises from reasons that are one part of the thesis.
That's a mouthful, but basically it means you're just restating the thing you're trying to prove.
Exactly. In our example, being impermanent is what we're trying to prove about sound.
Right.